and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Elliot Waldman. Before we dive into today's interview, just a quick reminder to tune in again on Friday for our editor's discussion, looking at the week's top headlines. The race for a coronavirus vaccine is on, and the Trump administration is feeling good about its chances. In a Rose Garden press conference last week, the president announced a new plan to find a vaccine by the end of the year, dubbed Operation Warp Speed. But many experts are doubting that that is possible, and there are many other questions swirling around the use of a vaccine, like who would get it first and how it would be distributed. Joining us now to discuss all of these questions is Paul Offit. He's director of the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Paul, welcome to Trendlines.
Thank you, Elliot.
So tell us about Operation Warp Speed. What was your reaction, and how realistic is this?
Well, so Operation Warp Speed is really the manufacturing end of this attempt to make a novel coronavirus vaccine. And what they're doing is they're saying, okay, there are many different companies now that are trying to make a vaccine. We don't know which among them will work. So what we're going to do is we're going to select some, assume that at least one among these will work, if not more, and just mass produce it. We'll start mass producing it. We'll take the risk out of it for the companies. And really, this is actually what happened with the polio vaccine in the mid-1950s. Jonas Salk had an idea of how to make a polio vaccine. Take polio virus, inactivate it with a chemical, and inject it into the arms of children. That vaccine hadn't been tested yet in a large-scale trial. That was tested between 1954 and 1955 in a large prospective placebo-controlled trial where 420,000 children got vaccinated and 200,000 were given placebo. While that was going on, while those trials were going on, 5 companies were mass producing the vaccine in the hopes that the vaccine would work, and it did. And then when it was shown to work, the day it was shown to work, really, then that vaccine could roll off the assembly lines and go into children's arms. That's basically what's being done here.
Now, are there risks to mass producing a vaccine without knowing whether it'll work or not?
Well, certainly the notion is that until it's shown to work, then this vaccine won't be given. So I think what they're doing is just trying to speed up the timeline. I mean, typically what happens is companies aren't going to mass produce a vaccine, meaning make millions or tens of millions of doses, until they've done a so-called phase 3 prospective placebo-controlled safety efficacy trial to show that it works. Then and only then would they mass produce it. Now, in order to speed up the timeline, you're just conflating those two things.
So tell us where we are right now in the search for a vaccine. How many candidates are out there, and what do you see as the most promising ones?
So there are more than 70 companies, actually, that are making vaccines. They're making them using all the ways we typically make vaccines, as well as a couple ways that we've never made vaccines before. So you can, for example, take a virus and kill it, which is, I know there's a Chinese company that's doing that. That's the way that we make the polio vaccine or the hepatitis A vaccine or the rabies vaccine. You can take this virus, and weaken it. So that it can reproduce itself into the body, but not well enough to cause disease, which is the way we make the measles vaccine, the mumps vaccine, the German measles or rubella vaccine, the chickenpox vaccine, one of the rotavirus vaccines are all made that way. You can take just one part of the virus, so-called subunit approach. In this case, that subunit would be that spike protein that emanates from the surface of the virus. That's the protein that attaches the virus to cells. If you can make an antibody response against that protein, then you're going to presumably prevent the virus from attaching to cells and therefore prevent the virus from infecting cells and therefore preventing the virus from causing an infection in you.
And that's what gives it the name coronavirus, right?
Right. That's what it looks like, a crown. Exactly right. You can take a so-called vectored virus approach, which Johnson & Johnson are doing and other companies, where you take basically a weakened virus, a different sort of harmless virus, into which you then clone the gene that codes for that surface protein, that spike protein. That's the way we make the dengue vaccine. That's the way we make the Ebola virus vaccine. Or you can do something that's never been done before, which is just take the gene that codes for that protein and then inoculate it into people either as DNA or as messenger RNA, and then your body makes that protein, that coronavirus protein, and once it makes that protein, then it makes an immune response against it. That's the messenger RNA approach that's now getting so much attention from Moderna, which just had a press release, I think this morning, and are having a press conference this morning, or had a press conference this morning about their vaccine.
We're recording this on Monday, I should mention for our listeners, but tell us a little bit more about that messenger RNA approach. Why has this never been tried before, and what makes it so revolutionary?
Right. It's just never been tried before because I think we just hadn't advanced far enough in the technology to make sure not only that we could sort of make messenger RNA, but that we could protect it really with this so-called complex lipid delivering system so that you could then stabilize that messenger RNA, which degrades rapidly. Once injected into the body, the messenger RNA then is translated to the protein, that spike protein, to which your body makes an immune response. We have no previous experience with that. And right now, Moderna, at least on Monday, has issued a press release looking at sort of what their experiences were with the first, frankly, handful of patients. I think about 60 patients or so who got various doses of this messenger RNA to look at whether or not they did make an immune response. And they did make what appears to be a neutralizing antibody response, meaning antibodies that neutralize the virus's ability to infect cells, and that it appeared to be safe. So we'll see. Remember, I think people need to keep in mind, though, that this is, when you're talking about sort of fewer than 60 people, that's not a lot of experience for a vaccine that eventually may go into tens of millions of people. So you'd like, before this vaccine ever rolls out, to see it tested in, frankly, tens of thousands of people to make sure it doesn't have an unanticipated safety problem and to make sure that it works. I mean, you still have no evidence that this particular product works. So we'll see.
Now, there was a brouhaha in France recently over a statement by the CEO of Sanofi, who suggested that should the company come up with a vaccine, the United States would be entitled to first dibs on it because it has put forward the largest amount of money toward its development. The French government predictably pushed back, arguing that any vaccine should be treated as a, quote, public good for the world and not subject to the laws of the market. Who's right here from your perspective as a physician, and what would be the more appropriate way to distribute a vaccine?
Well, I think the French government is right. I mean, I think that you as a player in the world stage, the United States has an obligation to really serve its function as a good friend and neighbor, and so if we have the economic ability and the technology and the scientific ability to make a product that can save lives, then our job is to do everything we can to save lives throughout the world. I think that's really what Bill Gates' biggest contribution has been. I mean, he looked up at, he had $60 billion and tried to figure out what can I do to make this world a better place, and thought, I think, that let me get vaccines into the developing world. And so he very quickly, we had 80% of the world then was immunized with hepatitis B virus, which is the most common cause of liver cancer, and he virtually eliminated that cancer because of his efforts. So I think Bill Gates, as a philanthropist, had exactly the right attitude, and I think the United States should have that same attitude. We are a world player, not just here for the United States' purposes only.
I think a lot of our listeners might be familiar with the scene from the movie Contagion, where at the end of a fatal pandemic, a vaccine is successfully created and a lottery is conducted to determine who will be first to get it by birth date. Is that what's going to happen here, or would there be some other kind of way to determine who gets the vaccine first?
Yeah, I don't think so. I love that movie. I mean, what was the hero of that movie? Who was the hero? It was vaccines were the hero. I mean, vaccines were the only way that we could really effectively save our lives and get back into the world. I hope that plays out that way now. I do think there's a lot at stake here because this could go one of two ways. I think our rush to try and make a vaccine, our rush to get this vaccine into the arms of the public, hopefully won't cause us to skip critical steps in understanding of this vaccine. So either this is going to play out one of two ways. Either one, it'll play out the way that it played out in the end of the movie Contagion, where people are lining up for this lottery-like system. Or two, we could shake an already fragile vaccine confidence by finding, after the vaccine is already released, that it causes sort of unanticipated problems. But I think in terms of deciding who gets it initially, in the best of worlds, that would be the CDC for the U.S. They would say, okay, here's phase one rollout. It goes to healthcare workers. It goes to people who work in nursing homes, people who work in mass transit, people who work in grocery stores, pharmacies, people who work in meatpacking plants. Here's phase two of who gets it, and then just go down the line for trying to protect this country against this disease in the most efficient way possible. That should be the CDC that makes it very clear how this rolls out.
So what would be the international equivalent of that? Would it be the WHO who determines which countries get access to the vaccine?
I would think so, yes. They should sort of set the policy as to, again, some countries have gotten on top of this problem much more quickly and efficiently than have others. And for those where the virus is still raging, you would think they would be first in line and then work your way down.
The Trump administration has already reportedly tried to secure a vaccine, quote, only for the United States. How concerned are you about politics getting in the way of an equitable distribution like that, especially given all the tensions going on between the U.S. and China right now?
To be honest, what I'm worried about is that politics would get in the way of making sure that this vaccine is tested adequately pre-licensure, or at least pre-approval, to make sure that it is held to a high standard of safety and efficacy before approval. Because I do think that, obviously the administration can sort of put their finger on the scales regarding certain medical or scientific issues that can be disconcerting. I think that happened with hydroxychloroquine when that was touted as a wonder drug for the treatment of this COVID-19.
You're referring to the anti-malarial medicine that hasn't been shown to have any effective benefit against COVID-19.
Right, or said another way, has been shown not to have benefit, and in several prospective controlled studies, and worse, that about 10% of patients had to drop out because of these heart toxicities caused by the drug. Similarly, I think that remdesivir, which is an antiviral drug that is used in the treatment of these patients and was shown to sort of decrease the length of illness from 15 days to 11 days, wasn't shown to actually prevent patients, I think, going to the ICU or patients dying. And I think that also is kind of oversold a little bit. And I just worry that that's happening here too. I know that with remdesivir, when that was announced, the market shot up 500 points this morning. Here on Monday, May the 18th, with the announcement by Moderna, the market shot up 700 points based on really a handful of patients. And you just want to let this process play out in a manner that enables you to know before you put something into tens of millions of people that it's safe and that it works. And I hope in our haste we don't overlook the importance of doing the right studies before we let this vaccine get out into the world.
Now, when you talk about mass producing a vaccine, as Operation Warp Speed is going to try to do in order to prepare for its eventual approval, what does that take? Walk us through exactly what's required to do that and how the process works.
Right. So and that's the hard part. The hardest part of the whole vaccine enterprise is mass producing it. It's hard because you have to have the right buffering agent, the right stabilizing agent, the right vial. You have to do real-time stability studies to make sure that the virus is stable as it goes from the tarmac to the person's arm. And you have to consistently make that vaccine from one lot to the next so that it's exactly the same. These aren't small molecule products like amoxicillin. I mean, if you make a batch of amoxicillin and you can say there's 50 milligrams per tablet in this batch and 50 milligrams per tablet in this batch, it doesn't work that way for biologicals. With biologicals like vaccines, the process becomes the product. And the process has to be the same again and again and again. I mean, there are often problems. If you go back to the analogy I made earlier with the polio vaccine, 5 companies made the polio vaccine, Jonas Salk's polio vaccine in 1955. One company made it badly. As a consequence, they didn't fully inactivate polio virus, and as a result, about 120,000 children in the United States were inoculated with live, fully virulent polio virus. 40,000 developed short-lived polio. About 200 were permanently paralyzed, and 10 were killed. I think it was probably one of the worst biological disasters in our country's history, and it can happen when you rush things. So I don't think we're ever going to experience anything like that again. But you just want to make sure that these products are held to a high standard of safety and efficacy. We are so determined to get a vaccine to prevent a disease that is terrifying us and paralyzing us. I just want to make sure that we hold it to a high standard of safety, remembering that most people who get this vaccine are going to be young, healthy people who would not typically die from this virus. So hold it to a high standard of safety.
The congressional hearings that were held last week, in which a whistleblower from the CDC testified in front of Congress, exposed a bit of disarray, a bit of kind of an erratic response by the government to the coronavirus pandemic so far. Given that, are you concerned at all about what might happen with the vaccine, especially since we need such a rigorous high level of safety to be ensured?
Right. As long as the system is not perturbed by by a heavier hand, say, from administration, as long as the system is allowed to play out the way it always plays out. And I trust the National Institutes of Health. They certainly know what it means to do a prospective placebo-controlled trial. There's the group that was put together by Francis Collins, who's the head of the National Institutes of Health, called the so-called ACTIVE Group, which stands for Accelerating COVID-19 Technological Innovations in Vaccines. I'm actually on that group. That's a group of experts, as well as the FDA and CDC and academia academia and pharmaceutical people who represent the pharmaceutical companies that have an interest in this vaccine, I think they all know how to make vaccines. They all know how to test vaccines. They all know what it is that you're going for here. And as long as that process plays out the way it should play out, and that that the government, in its haste to try and get this vaccine out there, doesn't put their finger on the scales and in any way perturb the system, I think we're fine. But you just want to make sure that the system plays out the way it should play out.
And that involves letting the experts, the scientists, the virologists stay in the driver's seat.
Yes. So right now the talk is of sort of a 20,000 or 30,000 person trial for each vaccine, where 20,000 people get the vaccine, 10,000 people receive a placebo, so that you then can see whether it works and it's safe. Now, that's going to be big enough as long as the attack rate in the placebo group is high enough to be able to tell whether or not your vaccine actually worked. Unfortunately, we're heading into the summer, where I think the incidence of this disease may lessen. Because as the weather gets hotter and more humid, for these respiratory viruses that have an envelope like this novel coronavirus, those viruses tend not to do as well in the summer. Although it's hard to know with this virus. We'll see. It's a bat coronavirus. It's just made its debut in the human population, so we're learning as we go here. But it's likely that it'll be a lesser incidence over the summer.
So, if I understand you correctly, there could be a problem with the vaccine that we don't realize until winter conditions set in again, at which point it may turn out to be not as effective?
No. What I'm saying is that you just want to be able to do a trial that enables you to determine whether or not the vaccine is effective. And the only way to know that is that the group that receives placebo, enough people get infected where you can say, okay, I know this works. So, for example, if you have 10,000 people in your placebo group and 1,000 people get infected with the virus, and you have 20,000 people in your vaccine group and 2 people get infected with the virus, then you can say this vaccine is highly effective. However, if you're in your 10,000 placebo group, only a few people get infected because you're moving into the summer months, then it's much harder to tell whether or not the vaccine was effective.
A question that I'm sure is on a lot of our listeners' minds is, do we have enough eggs to mass produce a vaccine?
Well, it's unclear to me that this vaccine is going to be made in eggs. I think that, if it's a messenger RNA vaccine, one just synthesizes messenger RNA in the laboratory. If it's a DNA vaccine, you just synthesize DNA in the laboratory. If it's a subunit vaccine, again, you just use an expression vector that has nothing to do with eggs. And usually these viruses are grown in mammalian cells. Whether it would be a whole-killed viral vaccine or a live attenuated viral vaccine, eggs would be an unlikely source, a substrate for this vaccine.
So the National Strategic Egg Reserve might turn out to be for naught.
Yes.
Now, there's already been a ton of misinformation about the coronavirus and about vaccines as well, as you alluded to earlier. How worried are you that we could see significant levels of resistance to getting vaccinated for the coronavirus?
Not worried. I think that if this vaccine goes through the kind of pre-approval studies that it should go through, and you see a vaccine that is safe and effective, and we still are scared to walk outside and scared to go to a sporting event and scared to go to a restaurant, scared to go to a museum, and you know that by getting this vaccine, you have dramatically lessened your chance of getting infected, I think people will be lining up for this vaccine. I think it's going to be more like the movie Contagion, where people are lining up and hoping that they can get it, not frankly worried about those who are choosing not to get it. Although, again, I think that if this vaccine is shown to be safe and effective, a choice not to get a vaccine is an irresponsible choice, because it's not a choice you're just making for yourself. It's a choice you're making for those with whom you come in contact. Is it your right to allow yourself to catch and transmit a potentially fatal infection? I don't think so, but we'll see how this plays out.
Are there any final thoughts you'd like to leave us with, Paul?
No, I think we're on the right track. I think there's every reason to believe we can make a vaccine. We know the protein we're interested in, the part of the virus we're interested in. We know we can induce neutralizing antibodies, which is to say antibodies that limit the ability of the virus to infect cells. I have every reason to believe that we can make a safe and effective vaccine. Just want to make sure we go through the process the way it should be gone through typically.
And I know that a lot of scientists have said on the very optimistic end of the scenario, 12 to 18 months is when we might have a vaccine tested, approved, distributed. Is that something to hope for?
Yeah, I think that if everything works perfectly, we could have a vaccine by the middle of next year.
Paul, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Elliot.
Paul Offit is director of the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. Trendlines is produced and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow him and WPR on Twitter. And while you're at it, don't forget to sign up for our free daily newsletter. It's the best way to keep up with what we're publishing, and you'll also get a code for a 25% discount off an annual subscription. To sign up, go to wpr.pub/trendlines. That's wpr.pub/trendlines. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.